Points. On a typical Caribbean plantation, the whites at the top, otherwise known as the rich whites or plantocracy, were at the peak of the social hierarchy. The rich whites were able to indulge in several privileges, such as their housing being superior to the poor whites and slaves. Evidence. Oh, it, um, it was only on the very small islands, such as in Antigua, that the majority of planters owned and lived on one plantation. In Jamaica and Barbados, it became common for the wealthiest planters to own several plantations but live on none. The explanation for that point is the richest plantation owners usually lived in England and stayed in towns when they visited the Caribbean. Rich planters who spent their lives in the Caribbean often lived in towns rather than on one of their estates, while the slaves working in the plantations lived in huts made from wattle, daub, and thatch, often with a small garden patch at the back and living yard at the front. To summarize all that has been said, the rich whites would often stay in great houses, for example, the Rose Hall Great House, if they stayed in the Caribbean, while the slaves stayed in their assigned slave quarters. Um, Evidence two, the whites were educated. Can you go back, please? The whites were educated and had social influence in societal matters. Wolmer's and Jamaica College were established for whites to be educated. Blacks were not allowed to attend these schools during slavery. Can you go to the other explanation, please? The rich whites determined the laws, rules, and punishments of society. They had the right to vote and were the only race that was elected into political positions. The younger generation were given the privilege to attend school and gain a higher education in prestigious learning institutions, which held great influence over their ability to socialize with other high class individuals like themselves. Can you go back to the last point? The whites could bear arms and held high positions in the militia. Other explanation, please. The rich whites were capable of owning and using weaponry and had an army of militia dispensable to them. The whites often used these in their punishments to drive fear into the enslaved. Link, the rich whites had several privileges and benefits during the slavery period blacks were unable to. You can go to question B. Question, why did some enslaved on a typical Caribbean plantation enjoy more privileges than others? Point. On a typical Caribbean plantation, there were divisions among the enslaved. The slave owners instilled this to gain more influence over the slaves. Evidence. Slaves were the backbone of society and they were the majority in the population. Sadly, they were insignificant to society. Although this was the case, they still had divisions and hierarchy. At the top of the hierarchy were the house slaves, next in rank were the skilled artisans. At the bottom were the vast majority of field hands who bore the brunt of the harsh plantation life. And the explanation for this, the position an enslaved person was on the hierarchy was also based on color, race, gender, occupation, caste, and class. There were lighter complexion people, mulattoes, and that had white ancestors. They were born Creole in the Caribbean and were seen to have a greater degree of ac- accu- acculturation into white culture, loyalty. They had more privileges and they had skills like the blacks did. This could benefit planters greatly. They were normally house slaves or looked after the slaves in place of their masters. Can you go back, please? The hierarchy helped slave owners to manage the slaves. The whites were a minority in the society. Slaves could easily rebel against their owners. Whites feared this would happen. The slave owners, having this in mind, divided the slaves among each other and also got slaves from different regions. This would prevent blacks from ever joining together, due to the fact they could not understand each other, had different religious practices, and also the competition to reach on the top of the hierarchy. House slaves never had to go through the tedious work field slave did. They had mostly domestic housework like cooking, cleaning, and taking care of the children. They got better food, treatment, clothing, and housing, whereas many field workers were not given sufficient clothing to cover their bodies. House slaves tended to be dressed with more modesty, sometimes in the hand me downs of masters and mistresses. A few were given rooms in the main house for the house slaves. To the field slaves, they were living life. The whites were smart and felt blacks to be inferior to them. Although the blacks had their own hierarchy that did not affect the whites at all, enslaved people still had no rights or a say and were viewed as low as animals. Whites separated blacks from them in society. Slave owners and their families had the best land and their children had the best schools. Blacks were not allowed to go to school with whites and had the worst and infertile land. Some schools that were built for white children in Jamaica are George's and Immaculate Conception High School. Darker skinned people were mostly field slaves. They were also predominantly male. Field slaves were very hard workers. These slaves would plant, tend, harvest cotton, sugar, rice, and tobacco. They had the worst treatment and torture. Food was limited, and most were scraps that were of bad quality. Most lived in similar dwellings, simple cabins, furnished sparsely, and their land were unfertile and rugged. Few slaves' clothes were torn and dirty because of the rigorous work they had to do. They also worked long hours and had hardly any breaks. These slaves were also prone to degra- degradation, rape, and brutality. Um, in conclusion, the higher a slave was on the hierarchy, the more privileged he/she would get. The hierarchy was used to benefit the slave owners in various ways. Lastly, the division of slaves was a huge factor to their society and views.
All
Point.
right, thank you. Thank you very much. Um, Davis and Hardy's here. All right. Thompson, Havel. All right, very good presentation for the students who have done their presentations. We still have a lot more work to do in improving the peel. We are not perfect as yet, but we are getting there. All right, so we still have some more peel activity to do. Just a question I want to ask. I'm not sure. I can't remember. If I look at the division of labor and slave plantation, because I'm not seeing the recording, I'm not sure if I recorded that class. Hello?
Sir, what did you say?
I asked if I would have looked at the division of slave labor. What is the last notes that you have?
Sir, the last note I have is the one that says the whites and enslaved feared each other on a typical Caribbean plantation.
That would be the
That would be under
question.
the social relations, sir.
Uh, 1 second. Because I don't know if I skip this topic. Because I'm not seeing a recording of it. We looked at this. Yeah, we did. The role
Yeah.
of the rich whites, the bookkeepers. Yeah, and then you got the group activity after that. On which date you got this activity? Thank you very much. So what we're going to do is that we're just going to wrap up uh, Sugar Estate today. And so what you would have looked at is last week, Monday, I believe, we would have looked at the different uh, groups, social groups, and also what they did on the plantation. And then you got an activity where you look at the different privileges of each group, because every group in a society, even those at the bottom from what you have presented, had privileges, right? Uh, not everybody in the society would have been equal. Even in today's society, there are people in today's society with various privileges. Now, so for today, we're going to cement the presentation by looking at the social relations in slave society. When we talk about social relations, what are we talking about?
Human interaction.
Yes, human interaction, correct. And so what we're going to do, we're going to discuss the social relations. We know for sure that social relations is the interaction between different groups within a society. And a society is, what's a society? What is a society?
So a society is a composition of various persons of different races and ethnicities.
Ethnicities, but you can have a society where everybody is of the same race and the same ethnicity, correct?
Yes, sir.
Yes, you could have that. So how do we define a society? What about slave society? When you hear the term slave society, what comes to mind? Slave society?
Or, that would be like a geographic space or location where one group is enslaved by another for cheap labor or labor.
Yes, yes, you are correct. And so, when we talk about social relations, who gave me that definition?
So I just said human interaction.
Yes. So, Norman, when I asked you this about social relations, you mentioned about the interaction between members of a society. It could be a community, right? Social relations can be how you relate to each other in your class. That's why on your report you have something that is called a social comment, because teachers observe how you relate to each other and give you a comment on your report, whether you're helpful, whether you're kind. Usually the social comments are the good part. But there are also relationships that are mean, but you wouldn't put that on a student's report. Uh, so social relations is how we each other relates in a society, or a community or a country, how different groups of people relate. So you are correct on that, Norman. Uh, Society is where a group of people living together in one space over a period of time. So the definition was correct, that people living in the same space, so that is correct. But you could have a group of people who is of the very same race and the same nationality that forms a society. You're following, ladies?
Yes, sir.
Following?
Yes,
Yes,
sir.
sir.
Very good. Now, when we talk about a slave society, which the Norman Hughes made the last comment about slave society,
No, sir.
who made that comment?
Groves.
Groves. All right. Thank you very much, Groves. So, Groves, you're correct. A slave society is a geographic space where one group enslaved another for cheap labor. So, you are correct. So, what we're going to do today is that we're going to look at social relations, not in just any society, but during slavery. What are some of the features of a slave society? Features of a slave society. Ladies, what are
Sir,
some of the features?
the whites or plantocracy, that's the word, right, sir?
Yes, plantocracy.
Um, they would determine the laws, so that be a future.
Yes, so you have the plantocracy. determine the laws. Yes, any other feature?
Sir, wealth.
What about wealth? What about wealth?
Sir, like what you own.
All right. So, but who own what in a slave society? Because in today's society, wealth is a very important feature of our society. Correct?
Yes.
Yes, because you have rich and you have poor in a society. But what is so unique about slave society when it comes to wealth? What is unique about slave society when it comes to wealth? Ladies, you just did the presentation.
Sir, wealth could have been owned by the masters taking, well, liking the enslaved. They could have done occupations that they could have afford manumission. The plantocracy, every different kind of anything including
Amen.
I'm leaving phone number, Jessica.
Go ahead for me, Groves.
Me, sir?
Yeah.
Sir, what are you talking about?
What about, tell me about wealth. How wealth is determined in a slave society? Who owns the wealth?
Sir, will it mostly be the plantocracy people? Plantocracy people?
Yes, the plantocracy owns the wealth. Any other feature of slave society?
Sir, there were more black people to white people.
So you had more blacks than whites. That's correct.
Sir, the hierarchical relations.
So you had the hierarchical relations, which is stratification. So the society, you have different groups, which is what we call the strata within a society, or different people with different status. Correct. What else about a slave society?
The color of your skin determines the privileges that you have.
Very good. Excellent. So the color of your skin determines, is it only a privileges?
Sir, the
Because
skill that you have. freedom.
your freedom, etc. Yes. And so what we have, and you're all correct, features of a slave society, your status, your freedom, your rights, your privileges were determined by your race. That is the first thing. Your race, color of skin, because you could be lighter skin, but you're of the black race. Wealth, the amount of money you own, and your skills. These are some of the features of a slave society. Your freedom is tied to your race, your color of your skin, your wealth, and your skills. Your rights in the society is also tied to your race, color of skin, wealth, and skills. Your privileges in the society is also tied by your race, your color of your skin, your wealth, and your skills. All right? Now, some historians consider a slave society to be a total institution. Williams, what I just said, repeat what I just said.
Sir, what did you say?
You're asking me what I just said?
Yes, I didn't hear you.
You didn't hear?
No,
Okay.
sir.
Edwards? Edwards? Morrison? What I just said, anyone who heard what I said?
Sir, I think you said that some historians considered the slave society to be an entire institution.
A total institution. You're close to it. Thank you very much. It's on your screen. If you look at, you can't see your PowerPoint. You're able to see the PowerPoint?
Yes, sir.
So I'm reading from the PowerPoint and students asking me what I'm saying. You're able to see the PowerPoint?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Because it seems as if you're not able to see the PowerPoint. So some historians consider a slave society to be a total institution. And a total institution is when you have everything located in one place. You don't have to leave that one geographic space to get anything really. It can survive by itself. So the plantation was considered a total institution. It had everything. What are some of the things that they had on a plantation?
Sir, houses.
So they lived there, houses, what else?
Sir, clinics and hospitals.
So yeah, the hospitals, yes, you don't have to leave the plantation. Every plantation had a hospital. What else?
Sir, their work areas.
Repeat.
Sir, their work areas.
So they had places where they work. Very good. What else?
Food.
Repeat.
Food.
So they get the food from the estate. They have section where they grow the food. Very good. Yes. What else? Why it is total?
Sir, would
What
schools
is
be
one of the most essential thing when it comes to life?
water?
Water. What about the plantation when it comes to water?
Sir, they'd have to distribute water to the various parts of the plantation.
Yes, but plantations are usually built close to where?
Rivers.
Rivers, yes, so they had water. Total institution, very good. Why it's considered total institution? What else? Think about it. So they live there, they work there, they get the food from there. If they are sick, they have a hospital that they go to. What else? If they do something wrong, you have a
Jail.
You have a prison, very good, a jail on it, right? So it was a total institution. It had everything. You live there, you work there, you're punished there, everything is there. And so, which is very correct, the plantocracy determines the rules and the laws of the society. So the whites, the very wealthy whites, determine the rules of the society. Another feature of the slave society is that it had rigid class lines. So you had the whites at the top. What came after? Who came after the whites?
The mulattoes.
The mulattoes, and who were at the base?
Blacks.
The
Blacks.
blacks. Very good. So you had rigid class lines on a in on a slave in a slave society. And also, usually in a slave society, it's not all the time, but there's just one main crop of production. They planted other things, but this main crop was their main crop that they exported. And in some colonies, what was that main crop?
Sugarcane.
Sugarcane. Was sugarcane the only crop that was produced by some estates? Some estates produce what? Outside of sugarcane, they
Cocoa.
produce what? Repeat.
Cocoa.
They produce cocoa. Very good. What else?
Sir, logwood.
They produce logwood. Very good. What else?
Tobacco.
Tobacco. No, can remember they would have changed over, but in the earlier, no, I wouldn't say tobacco. In the US, all right, I should qualify that. In the United States, in Virginia, they would have produced tobacco. So you're correct. But in the Caribbean, so with the logwood, sugarcane,
Coffee.
coffee, what else? What is that little white puffy stuff that people use, especially on babies?
Cotton.
Cotton. Very good. So some plantations tend to produce the other monocrop, meaning mono one crop production. And that crop you send to the metropole and North America. So yes, metropole, tell me some countries who were part of the metropole. Metropole, look on the screen, metropole. Which countries were the metropole that they send the goods to?
Sir, England.
England, yes. Where another place?
Spain.
Metropole. Metropole. England. What?
Sir, Spain.
France, Spain, very good. Very good. And they also, so those countries in Europe that own plantations or own colonies in the Caribbean were called the metropole. Please write that in your notebooks. And also they are going to send goods to North America, because North America, what are some of the things North America trade with the Caribbean? Where the enslaved get some of their food from? Or what type of food they would receive from North America?
Sir, like barley and oats.
Barley, yes, but one main crop, not main crop, main produce. Salt fish. So all the clothes that the enslaved people wore came from North America. The wood that was used to make what it was used to make. The wood that was, repeat?
Sir, I was gonna ask you to repeat what you asked.
So the wood, so there was a type of wood that the Caribbean people would have purchased from North America to make something. What was that thing that they made? What they put the sugar in?
Hogshead.
The hogshead, yes. Ladies, you need to go and read. You need to go and read.
Sir, was Portugal a metropole?
Yes, Portugal was also a metropole. All right. And so race and color, when we look at the whites, whites were at the top of the social ladder, and you had persons who were whites, include the governors, the government official, the merchants, the planters, the overseers, the medical doctors, the attorney, the bookkeepers. So these are examples of white. What are some of the social privileges that they had? Or rules? One, whites were not allowed to marry blacks. That was a no-no. That was a social rule. Whites could not marry blacks. Blacks were not allowed to drink tea and eat with the whites. So even though they live in the great house and they get a little of the leftover tea and the leftover food, they could not sit at the table and eat. Also, only the whites had franchise. Franchise meaning the rights to vote. So they were the only ones who could vote. They were the only ones who could be elected to political office. And they were the only ones who could pass laws. All right. So what are some of the privileges of the whites? Somebody read this for me, please.
They ate better food, they wore better clothing, their housing was superior, their job was less physically demanding, educated and have social influence. Wolmer's and Jamaica College were established to educate whites. Blacks were not allowed at these institutions during slavery. Owned the wealth of the island, slaves and land, they could bear arms and had high positions in the militia, political rights and privileges.
Thank you very, very much. So these were some of the privileges of the whites. So whites were the only ones in slave society, with the exception if you are working in Belize, because in Belize, blacks were allowed to carry arms, guns, but in other parts of the Caribbean, you were not allowed to, only the whites alone could bear arms, right? Privileges, somebody, all right. Let us look at the mulattoes. So we look at the whites, let us look at the mulattoes. Somebody read that for me, please.
Some acquired their freedom either by manumission or as a grant from their masters, mostly domestic slaves, products of miscegenation.
Miscegenation. What do we mean by miscegenation?
Sir, you would have a white male having whatever with a black slave or a black enslaved lady.
Yes. So miscegenation is racial mixture. So miscegenation is not only when white and black have sexual relationship and produce a mulatto, but it could be also a mixture between the whites and the Indians, or the blacks and the Indians, or the blacks and the indigenous people, or the whites and the indigenous people. Miscegenation is that racial mixture. Let us look at, continue for me.
They were not able to vote, some owned property, behaved like whites, abused blacks, allowed to marry blacks.
So yes, so the mulattoes were allowed to marry, but only blacks they were allowed to marry. But some of them behaved like they were whites, and some of them owned property. How do you think that they would have owned property? How do you think that they would have come to own property?
Sir, with
Some
the
of
many
the
privileges,
mulattoes.
sir, the many privileges that they have, and because of their occupation, they would have gotten money to own property, and even as a grant from their fathers, because of the sexual relations they had with an enslaved, they would give their sons or daughters a grant.
Very good. So, because most of them, their fathers were planters, very wealthy planters, they were able to, when the fathers usually, will something in terms of when they die, they leave back properties for them. Very good. But it's not only we had the free coloreds or the mulattoes, and in fact, you had another group. If you were an enslaved mulatto, you could not own property. Only the free mulattoes were allowed to own properties. All right? But we had another group that were the free blacks. What do we mean by the free blacks? The free blacks.
Sir, not involved in the system of slavery.
Yes, so they were not involved. Why?
So they got freedom from their slave masters.
Very good. So they acquired manumission, but even though they were freed, they could not vote. They owned very small properties. They were rejected and scorned by the other shades of brown, especially those of the mulatto usually scorn them. And in fact, the mulattoes were allowed to marry the free blacks, not the enslaved blacks. Only the free blacks they were allowed to marry. And then at the enslaved people who were at the very base, they had no privilege, no rights, little or no rights and privilege, I should say. And this was the majority of the population. So what are some of the reasons? Some enslaved had more privilege than others. Somebody read this for me, please.
Reasons some enslaved had more privilege than others. They were lighter complexion, the mulattoes. They were born Creole in the Caribbean and were seen to have had a greater degree of acculturation into white culture, loyalty, and
Stop there for me, please, Brown. Thank you. So enslaved people who were born in the Caribbean were considered Creole, and enslaved people were born in Africa, they were African born slaves. And so the Creole slave who were born in the Caribbean usually felt that they were better than the African born slave. And so Creole slaves were treated a little, they were very loyal, I should say. They were the informers in the society, very loyal and submissive. Always you know, that closeness to the plant. The African-born slave never had that level of close relations with the plant. Continue for me, Brown.
Seasoned slaves would enjoy more privileges than newer ones. They had
Mm-hmm.
skills that could benefit the planters greatly. Planters' preference, attraction to black women, sexual relationships.
Stop there. So those planters, those black enslaved women who had sexual relations with the planters had privileges because of their relationship with the planters than other females. All right, continue for me, please.
Age of enslaved women who bore more than 6 children were oftentimes rewarded with exemption from difficult tasks.
Yes. So if a woman bear a lot of children, there was some form of exemption because she would have given back a lot of cheap labor to the planter. So she got some level of exemption. And also, some of them actually earned the trust of the planter. And if you inform in terms of you go and you tell the planter what they are saying about him and his household, then you usually get some form of privilege. All right, thank you very much, Brown. So when we return on Monday, we're going to look at family life and slavery, slave marriages, the relation between the master and the slave, the relation between white women and the enslaved women, and whites and enslaved, why they would have fared each other. So if you notice what I'm doing right here is that I am going through the question that you would have received on Monday and what you would have presented on. All right, ladies, enjoy the rest of the week.
Thank you, sir, and same to you. Bye, sir.
Hi, sir.
Bye.
Sir, did you mark Christian present?
Christian, let us see.
Sir.
So go ahead for me.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
All right, Emmons is here. Which other student has become late? Davis is here. Morgan Sawyers, absent. All right, ladies.